Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. Very pleased that the Institute of Politics and the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy tonight is co-sponsoring this very special lecture. As you know, we have an author of a new book. The new book is Coming of Age, The Story of Our Century by Those Who've Lived It. And he certainly is qualified, since this gentleman has lived at large in this century himself. His books are numerous, but his bestsellers are Hard Times, Working, and Race, and his Pulitzer Prize-winning book is The Good War. He also has an interesting variety of jobs that he has taken himself, apart from the folks that he's interviewed about their jobs. He has been an actor on radio soap operas. He's been a disc jockey, a sports commentator, a TV actor, and of course he's well known throughout the country for the 38 years that he has been a talk show host, long before talk radio became quite its phenomenon today in the political world. He's been described in many ways. The Washington Post calls him the master interviewer. It's believed that he's had over 9,000 interviews. He has been described by the gentleman that we will hear from, and I'll have the pleasure of introducing after our speaker. He's been described by John Kenneth Galbraith as a national resource who gets to the deeper heart of our history and our national life. But it really is very foolish when you have a work of art before you to spend time trying to describe it when people can see it for themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, the author of Coming of Age, Studs Terkel.
Thank you very much. I've been called many things in my life, but never a work of art. When you say that, smile. By the way, it's Phil Sharp, whom I still address as Congressman Sharp. He was a Democratic congressman from Indiana for 10 terms. That in itself is a political miracle. And so when I refer to him as Congressman Sharp, it's simply wishful thinking. I was thinking about being here, and the reason I came here is to hear John Kenneth Galbraith, whom you will hear shortly. And I was thinking, this is the pulpit that I have here. I call this a pulpit because Mahalia Jackson, with whom I worked very closely, the gospel singer Mahalia, always said, Studs, you should have been a preacher. So here I've got the pulpit. You are my captive congregation. When it's over, we'll have the collection. Also, this will be in the manner of a storefront church, in that it's call and response, question and answer. So I hope I'll try to be as brief as I can so we can have questions from the audience. I like that give and take. Now, the title of the book is ironic. You know, Coming of Age, as you recall Margaret Mead's classic, Coming of Age in Samoa, which is young people reaching the age of puberty. My coming of age is 70 and over, the biblical, scriptural 70, and thus life really begins, as Ken Galbraith can tell you. Life really begins because Maggie Kuhn, who was the founder of the Great Panthers, you may recall, militant old people, when she was mandatorily retired, she and a couple of her social worker friends, the others were crying, what'll we do? And Maggie said, are you out of your minds? We have a little pension, enough to live on, not in the manner of Donald Nirvana Trump, but enough to live on. And it's the 60s. We can put our warm old bodies on the line right now with the young and civil rights and the anti-war protesters. For the first time, we're free. At that time, you remember that Chris Christopherson wrote that song, Me and Bobby McGee, that Janis Joplin sang. And there's a great line in it, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And so that was more or less the basis of the book. The subtitle is This Century, the Story Told by Those Who Lived It. Now here's the 20th century coming to an end. The most remarkable and horrendous century, both, 5 years away from the new millennium. Now, who are the best to tell us about it? There are the traditional historians, there are the pundits with 30-second sound bites, or there are those who have actually experienced it, those who lived through the Great Depression of the 30s, World War II, the Cold War, McCarthy, the 60s. By the way, it's fashionable to put down the 60s these days, you know. The 60s was the one time when the young had causes outside themselves. Freedom Summer, Civil Rights, the war, the 60s. But it's put down regularly. On Meet the Press recently, the conservative George Will and the liberal, God help us, Sam Donaldson. You see, and the case of calling liberal is a case of what I call lingo promiscuity. They both agreed that the 60s was rotten. And they both agreed it was a time of extremism and druggism and excessism, all that is rotten today, attributable to the 60s. But Joan Nestle, I never met, said something quite beautiful. It's fashionable to put down the 60s by those who delight in the failure of dreams. And in a sense, that almost caught it. And then came after the 60s the computer age, which we can talk about in a moment. The computer in my own rather dissenting, well, not dissenting, but feeling of a high-tech Philistine. But now we come to something else. And one of the keys to our century, to now, is that there is no past, especially among the young. By the way, I'm delighted here with this audience, young. It's fashionable to put down the young, too, but how can they be put down if their own history has been denied them? Consider the Depression. Consider labor, trade unions. Many young are anti-union. And you wonder why the young, the word conservative young was an oxymoron once upon a time. Young were always considered challenges to the established thought. Here they're the defenders of Newt Gingrich. But you have the young who are anti-labor, a great many. So I'm waiting for a bus. This is an anecdote, but it's true and funny and telling. I hope it's funny. And it was, at the moment, I was waiting for a bus a few days before Labor Day, and I live in a neighborhood that's a have street in a sea of have-nots. And it's a have couple, an upscale young couple, very handsome indeed. He had the latest issue of Wall Street Journal neatly wrapped under his arm. She had the latest issue of Vanity Fair. And they were a beautiful couple. And I couldn't make conversation with them. Wait for a bus every day for a year. I tried to make conversation. They turned away. And so I talked to myself out loud. And by the way, I find that audience very appreciative. And so, but I can't make comments. So this one day I say, Labor Day coming up. Silence. They turn away. And I, well, it's a challenge. The bus is late in coming. I say, Labor Day is the day we march down Michigan Boulevard, Chicago's main thoroughfare. Banners held high, steel workers, union auto workers, farm equipment workers, packing house. And he turns to me in the manner of Noel Coward, says, we loathe unions. Well, I say, I got a pigeon here. Ooh. No bus. No bus. And here they are. And so I say, now I become the ancient mariner, fixing him with a glittering eye. And I say, how many hours a day do you work? It's something of a non sequitur, so he's caught unaware. So he says, 8. This time I got him pinned against the mailbox. No bus yet. And I says, how come you don't work 18 hours a day? Your great-grandparents worked 18 hours a day. And he's looking out, and she is too, holding his hand, trembling, and looking out as though for a passing patrol car. I still look, no bus. Now I got it made. And I say, you know why you work 8, not 18? Because 4 guys got hanged 100 years ago. It's the Haymarket affair in Chicago, when guys got hanged fighting for the 8-hour day. So true. And as they were union guys. By this time, the couple is somewhat trembling, and the bus comes, and I never saw them again. But I'm convinced, in the 35th floor of that upscale condominium, she's looking out the window every morning. He says, is that old nut still there? Now, why do I feel good telling this story? Why do I feel so, even though it's a terrible thing, I made this couple so uncomfortable and frightened them, perhaps. Why do I feel good? And I'm like Huck Finn on the raft. Remember Huck and the escaped slave Jim and the bounty hunters, the slave chasers come along. That guy you saw, is he white or black? And Huck lies, says, he's white. And of course, Jim escapes. And Huck says, I felt so bad because he violated the law and everything else. But then why do I feel so good, he says. And so in a sense, that's it. Now, it's easy to blame this young couple, but now you think about it. What do they know about labor? You pick up, let alone Wall Street Journal, pick up the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, the prestigious. You have a feature section, sports section, of course. You have entertainment, style, fashion section, and a business section, all about LBOs and about downsizing, which is euphemism for mass firings, of course. You have all that, but is there a labor section? Because this is a joke, a labor section. Is there a labor page? Is there a labor column? Once in a while you have a bit about Pickett may have thrown a rock at a scab, but it's a story. Or today, the humiliation of the United Auto Workers in Decatur, Illinois, going back to Caterpillar. But there is no coverage. So how would they know about that? How do they know about Janora Johnson Dollinger? Now, she's one of the heroines of the book. And Janora Johnson Dollinger is in bed, and she's got her third pacemaker, has a battalion of pills all around her, from Indoral to Nitro to everything, diabetes. And Janora says, I'm not going to make it. This is a long-distance phone call, but I know Janora, knew her years ago. She's one of the heroines of the famous sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan in 1937. That's when the United Auto Workers and the CIO were formed. And that's the famous strike when the guys and some women sat in the General Motors plant in Flint for 44 days. They sat in the famous strike. The world was watching it. And she's one of the heroines. So I say, Janora, and she's tired, and I'm not going to take the wheelchair, and I may be going soon. And she did die, by the way, about 10 days ago, Janora did. But she did see herself in the book. And so I say, Janora, at that moment, remember 1937, Christmas season, Flint, Michigan, and suddenly she becomes a young girl on the roof of that bus. The 83-year-old invalid, suddenly this vibrant young girl. I'm on the roof of that truck, Studs. It's going slowly down the streets of Flint, and I'm calling out through a megaphone. Or is it a PA? I forget, she says. To the women to come out and cross the police lines because the cops are throwing tear gas into the plant to smoke out the guys and break the strike and hopefully break the union. And so she's urging the women to cross the line and break a couple of windows so the guys can breathe and stay in. And then she describes the scene. And a woman crosses, and a cop grabs her, and he holds her by the coat, and she walks right out of the sleeves of the coat. And he's holding her, and she crosses. Then another, and we won. And she speaks of Mardi Gras Day and Liberation Day, and then she falls back on the pillow. I hear this on the phone. And she says, that's for crying out loud. That was her phrase. This should be a better world than it is. Now, how does that young couple know Janora? They don't, you see. And so we have something in which there's no yesterday, something I call a national Alzheimer's disease. There's no yesterday. There's no memory. There's no memory because there is no yesterday. And so in a sense, the people in this book are describing that situation. Oh, they have all kinds of infirmities, of course. Where did I put my glasses? Right here. Or where did I put my shoes? But they indelibly remember an indelible experience. A certain moment of their lives, that is an indelible experience for the country. That's the exciting part about it. And of course, the forgetfulness takes on all sorts of, as Ken Galbraith can tell you, since he was involved directly with the New Deal of FDR and that period. What happened? So you have guys today, the political frauds in charge of things, who say big government's got to go. They're the ones whose granddaddy's butts were saved by big government in the 30s. Ken points out that where would Bob Dole of Kansas be today without farm subsidies? Nowhere. And so you have the 30s and you have the Great Depression. Where would Ronnie be if his papa in Dixon, Illinois didn't get a job on the WPA? And so we have this no memory of past because there is no past. And so we have race. And we have talk about dysfunctional families and single parents on welfare. We're forgetting that there was something called relief back in the 30s, overwhelmingly white. And a guy comes home with a tool chest on his shoulder, Small boy remembers his father coming home 11 o'clock in the morning, a good carpenter. Suddenly he's out of work. And he's out of work for 5 years, and he gets mad and frustrated and drinks and fights with his wife, and he leaves out of shame and has a single-parent family, and it's called relief. It's a quote-unquote dysfunctional family, which is as phony a phrase there ever was. And so we seem to forget that aspect of it. And so we have crime on the streets. We have crime, and so therefore the answer is more prisons and 3 strikes and you're out, when the obvious answer, 2 + 2 is 4, something else called jobs. A simple anecdote and story. And one more and then I'll close. And this is Chicago, the Sheraton Hotel, about 5 years old. When it was finished near the lakefront, the word went out, 1,000 jobs are available. The next day, 5,000 people show up along that bitter cold lakefront, overwhelmingly young, black, male, which is the code word for them, is, of course, street crime. They're there waiting for these jobs, 5:30 till 6 o'clock at night. So, of course, and the job doesn't pay too much, but there it was. So where did the 4,000 who didn't get the job go? They go to the obvious place where they're known, the street corner. And all that energy, 9 to 5, a buck in the pocket, self-esteem, a family, is not used there because there is no job. So he has to go antisocial. And so we have street crime. And so the answer by the wise men who run us today is more prisons instead of jobs, obviously. Where are the jobs to come from? Where's the dough going to come from? I'm sure Ken, I'm holding off on him, can tell you about our military expenditures. What was the raison d'etre for our incredibly precedent-shattering, greatest in the history of the human race military budget? The evil empire. Well, if there ain't no evil empire no more, what's the reason for this? The same ones who would cut down on health, education, welfare, if anything, increased the military budget. So we have a cockeyed situation. I want to end with one last personal comment about the computer age. You know, Bill Gates has a new book. It's probably the new age coming out, and I'm sure it's great. But the computer and me don't get along. I'm just learning the typewriter. And so when you say software to me, it means pillowcases and Turkish towels. Hardware, naturally, hammer and nails. And so here you've got the computer, but I know it does many things quickly. I know it saves time quickly. I know it gathers information quickly, but the old doctor asked the young doctor, how did our patient do last night? And the young doctor punches in the computer. Out comes the latest lab test. He says, oh, Mrs. Smith, she did fine, see. He said, that's not what I asked. What did she tell you? Was the pain different today than it was yesterday? He said, I don't know about that. Well, if you don't know about that, you know nothing about her. Isn't that why you became a doctor, the laying on of the hands? So something is being missed as we go along. Jacob Lawrence, the great painter, the great African-American painter, who recently retired at the University of Washington in Seattle, says the students frighten him, that it's the computer crazy students. He says, they laugh at him. He says, I walked into a studio, and you know it's an artist's studio. You smell the paint, the oil, the canvas. He's got a hand tool in his hand, a chisel. He loves hand tools. He loves the hand. He says it's organic, a Frank Lloyd Wright work. The fingers and the palm of one. And that hand does miraculous things. So I worked for 6 months on this painting with my hand and this brush, feel the paint, all that. The kids laugh at me because they say they can get a painting done in half an hour and not even touch it. So that touch. And you go into the city room of any newspaper today, in the old days there was noise. It wasn't the front page exactly. There was noise and there was calls back and forth and hollering. Today it's silent as a tomb as young people, reporters, young men and women next to each other, yet planets apart, are looking into the terminals. I love that word, terminals. looking in the terminals, and they're planets away from each other. And there's the silence. And I'll end with this anecdote. It's the Atlanta airport, and it's modern, computerized, and the Atlanta airport, as you leave the gate, there are trains waiting to take you to concourses, the ultimate destination. Trains are cool and smooth and crowded and silent. And as you enter the train, you hear a voice up above. Oh, the voice calling out Concourse 1. It's a human imitating a robot. It is. You know, it's Concourse 1, you know, Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Concourse 2, Chicago, Decatur. And so as we're about to leave, a young couple pushed their way past the pneumatic doors, parked, and they get and just make it. That voice, without losing a beat, says, because of late entry, we're delayed 30 seconds. And, of course, everybody's looking daggers at this young couple who are just cringing. And so I happen to have had a couple of drinks. I just steel myself for adventures of this sort. And so I say, calling out loud, and I'm out of a train caller, George Orwell, your timer's come and gone. Yeah, see, you're laughing, but not on that train. Oh, boy, I joined the couple. I'm cringing. We're at the foot of Calvary, waiting. And so I start thinking, what in the world is happening to us? Laughter is gone. Perspective is gone. The machine to be taken us over. Silence, cat's got our tongues. Just as your little baby. And the little baby is on the lap with about 6 months old. And so I hold my hand like this away from the baby because my breath might be 100 proof, you know. So I say to the baby, sir or madam, what is your opinion of the human species? And the baby, of course, bursts into a laugh. And that's when I hollered, great God Almighty, there's hope. Might be. So that's what we've come to. And so that's the dilemma we're faced at the moment. And I thank you for that. And now the man I want to hear.
I'm sure I've been wrong about many things in my public life, but certainly not in describing you as a work of art. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a double treat tonight because we have another of the living masterpieces who is going to speak to us, a professor emeritus here at the university, someone who has been a towering figure in American political and intellectual life, figuratively as well as realistically. And I must say, as the director of the Institute of Politics, it's incumbent on me to seize the opportunity for a small commercial. He was present at the creation of the Institute and has been an extraordinary a part of its history. Ladies and gentlemen, John Kenneth Galbraith.
Mr. Director, Congressman, studs, my old friend, all of you, let me tell you my pleasure in being part of this evening, which is very great, and which takes me over a long span of time, perhaps enormously interesting to me and less so to you. That is the nature of speeches from those of mature years. I have known Studs Terkel. You see the possibility of error. I have known Studs now for more than 30 years, both as a friend and as a radio commentator and a radio interrogator. My memory goes back to various occasions when my publisher, stirring himself in an unusual way to sell books, something you do not ordinarily expect from a publisher, would ask me to travel a bit, and I would go to Chicago. There, as in a few other cities, I would be interviewed by radio talk show hosts who would not have read the book and were rather proud of the fact, and who would quickly turn me over to the telephone, where the first question would be, Professor Galbraith, I haven't read your book, but I disagree with you. Could you tell me why? And the relief from that would be Studs Terkel, who would have read the book, would ask perceptive, interesting questions, some of which you would have difficulty answering. The conversation, however, would be good, and I think good for the audience. And the best of all, he would end the program by saying how good the book really was. This is the occasion when Studs comes here to talk about a book of enormous interest to me, partly because I have a chapter in it, on growing old and the experience of a lifetime. And I must say tonight, I would just say one word on that. There has been, as one has reviewed the public scene over a lifetime, some quite wonderful changes. Nothing I would emphasize more than in this university. I don't think very many of the members of the faculty in economics, when I first arrived here, would now get tenure. I hope not. And the students, when I first came here 61 years ago, divided as between the white shoe boys who came from the Boston, New York aristocracy and bourgeoisie, who prided themselves on how little work they had to do to get through a year at Harvard. And there were tutoring bureaus up on the square so that the more retarded could get quick action the night before examination. This, as I say, was the larger part of the undergraduate body. There were good students. There were hardworking students. They were known, Studs, as the greasy grinds, looked down upon by all right-thinking scholars. And one has seen the improvement in politics. I am not a devoted admirer, Congressman, of the present members of the House of Representatives or its leadership, but I never come here to talk politics. But I would say that on the whole, over the years, there has also been an enormous improvement in the people who make our legislation. Hard as that may be to believe on occasion. I could go into detail on that, but perhaps it would be sufficient to say a word about the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which then sent legislators to Washington who were not elected but appointed by James Michael Curley, and who had the wonderful discipline in Washington, the superb discipline which came from knowing that an indictment was always possible. Now we have no member of the Massachusetts delegation who could not be a member of the faculty of the Kennedy School, and there is a distinct possibility that quite a few of them one day will be on the faculty. These are the beacons of progress that we have noticed in our lifetime and which I share with our wonderful guests tonight. There have been, however, some things that have gone wrong. And I've commented on them in the past. One or two of you here will have seen my past comment. I want to refer to the deeply adverse development that has plagued my life in these last years and which I share with you tonight, studs. That is, and may be called, the still syndrome. I suffer from it every day. Once in my youth, the sensitivity of the old was greatly respected. One did not emphasize physical and mental decline, inevitable and apparent though these were. Now I find they receive daily, even hourly mention, and that is my experience. Professor Galbraith is still getting that exercise I hear when I go out for a walk. Still lecturing, I will hear tonight after this lecture. Still writing, many say I write when I publish a book or a review. Still writing. Still interested in politics, I'm told, when I show up at a meeting. Still imbibing when I have a drink. Still that way, someone observes, when my eyes are seen to light up on encountering a beautiful woman. The physical and mental deterioration that go with great age are an undoubted fact. They cannot be avoided. Their evidence cannot be wholly concealed. But none of this justifies the uncontrollable tendency on the part of others to proclaim the fact, to tell the victim how certain, assured, and obvious will be our decline. I plead that we know how much a lifetime has improved. I beg you not always to be talking of the poorly engineered end. Again, my pleasure in you, my audience, my pleasure in being here with my great friend, and my unwilling tendency to talk for my own enjoyment, having now been exhausted, I turn the conversation back to the audience, because nothing in the Kennedy School is so enjoyed as asking long and complex questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be happy to entertain questions for Studs Terkel at this point, and I believe there's a microphone up in this area as well as the two here on the floor. I guess there's the two on the floor here. So if you'll line up, we'll alternate and hope that people will try to keep their questions short so we can maximize participation. Why don't you come on up and we'll just get started right here.
Simply to say that I think Ken Galbraith still has that exquisite sense of irony. Yes, ma'am.
Direct this question at both Studs Terkel, and I would really like to hear remarks by Professor Galbraith. In your lifetime of experience, what are the most profound changes in the world arena that have affected your personal vision of the world, and what is the most important piece of advice that you would give to young people as you envision significant future changes?
One of the most important changes for me, I suppose, is just growing old itself, the very nature of it. But I think the Great Depression played a tremendous role, not simply because of the heroism of the people involved, involving grassroots and community work, but a leadership. Not that Roosevelt was Einstein, he wasn't, but sense enough, and of course Ken could talk at length about that, he's more directly involved. Surrounding with people who had a sense of history and need. So the right-hand man was Harry Hopkins, who was head of the Work Projects Administration. And Harry Hopkins said, the great need, and Roosevelt used the phrase in the second inaugural address, I see 1/3 of a nation ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed. Harry Hopkins said, we've got to feed the hungry. That's the first thing. We've got to clothe the naked. We've got to house the homeless. He said that. Then he said, then we'll talk about the ledger. And so the big difference then is the fact they spoke of human needs and not the needs of a special kind of accountant engaged in double bookkeeping, you see. And so in a way, that difference to me is a big one. The role a government can play. But also at the same time, simultaneously, the activity down below, history from below. Because I lived in this hotel, a men's hotel. All kinds of guys were there. There were union guys, also were scabs there. And there were arguments and fights and drunken bouts. But always the feeling, that sense of life underneath that's not fully expressed, and during the 30s was. So somehow that played a big role in my life. But I think that Ken talk about that matter, the changes.
No, you've answered the question.
Oh.
Hi, this is for Studs. In listening to your talk, I really enjoyed it. But one thing that kind of struck me was that I felt like I was on the wrong side of all the things that you brought up. The heroes, the people that I like, the issues that I like as well. And so it brought up a couple of questions. One was being someone who kind of likes all the stuff that you kind of don't like, and was wondering, is there kind of a hopeful future for us? What should we be excited about? What do you think we should be excited about, one? And then I guess the flip side of that is, given that we kind of trash big government, kind of trash the 60s, are there any merits to some of the issues that we bring up in terms of some of the programs and some of the movements?
Well, I think we have new kinds of people active who weren't active then. I think, and especially women. And it's a small point, but a big one when you think about it. Those who are active, there were battles, there were suffragists all the time, of course. The suffragists for years were considered flakes and marched and chained themselves to railings. But that aspect, now it's accepted just as a gay life with all its troubles. In that sense, there seems to be changes have made. Long way to go. Race is still the tough one, and it's tough because the real issue is never discussed. A moment ago we spoke of the Sheraton Hotel and the guys waiting for jobs. The job issue is hardly ever discussed, the economic one. So suppose a guy can go into a restaurant, and there is of course we know there is a remarkable middle class among blacks who never had it so good. Many of them did, more than expected. Well, for the great many, it's probably worse than it's been because you had your chance, the fashionable comment in cocktail parties, I know. But if a guy can't rub two nickels together, what's the good of the restaurant that he can enter if he ain't got the two nickels? So we haven't discussed those aspects. But a lot of changes for the good, as Ken too pointed out, have taken place. And I don't mean to put that down to neglect it. It's terribly important. The very fact that you were here, this group, I imagine a variety of backgrounds is here, may not have been the case when he was a young teacher here, an instructor here. So all this is happening in the midst. So it's a contradictory moment, a transition moment, I guess you'd call it. Do you want to take off on that?
No,
Another question for Studs. Studs, you mentioned that this was a church, and I wanted to ask you how you see the resurrection of the labor movement coming about, and can we have an equitable society without a resurrected labor movement?
No, we obviously can't have without a resurrected labor movement, because we know before there was a labor movement, we know what happened as far as work is concerned and who had what and the nature of the sweatshops and all that occurred. There is something happening. Labor movement, we know it's taken a terrible beating, and you may be aware of the recent humiliation of United Auto Workers, and going back to Decatur, Illinois, they had this long strike against Caterpillar that's doing better than it's ever done, with scabs and with others breaking through. And that's a bad moment. But I think something is happening. There are younger workers who never were active in labor before. I'm talking about some of the new Teamsters. There's a group called Teamsters for a Democratic Union, of which you hear very little. You're told that Ron Carey beat the thugs and got in thanks to federal intervention. It did intervene, it did play a role, but the big role was the rank and file movement. So we do have that occurring, though it's a rough time. And the big thing comes back to the young and their knowledge, or should say lack of knowledge, and rather disdain for trade. And so we're back to the young again, who knowledge, I guess, knowing what's about. There's no stupidity here. There is ignorance, which is something else, not being given the facts. How can they get the facts if we have, our language is perverted? We have talk radio And we speak of radio as in the liberal media, which is a joke, of course, with Rush and all his clones and millions listening. Or we have public television described as left television, leftists such as William Buckley Jr., for example, and John McLaughlin and the Capital Gang, and Brown. Is it Ron? What's his name? Brown, who's sort of a very conservative black guy. And so we have the language itself is being perverted, and so the nature of the quality of labor unions is being perverted as well. It's a tough battle, but something is popping. The new election is interesting, so we'll see what happens. Yes, sir.
This is one of the very important questions of our time. There's no doubt in my mind I've had a measure of association with the trade union movement, that it fell in recent times under a bureaucratic stasis. There was a long time during the Cold War when the AFL-CIO was more concerned with foreign policy than domestic policy, and more concerned about communism than it was about the well-being of workers in this country. But there's a larger question which we should at least ponder. There are some of the old functions of the trade union movement that must now be taken over by the state, by government. The service worker scattered over the landscape is not a natural object for organization, and this makes the minimum wage an extraordinarily important thing. The minimum wage is the counterpart of trade union organization in the widely scattered service industries. There is also a possibility that we have loaded a bit too much on the wage structure, pensions and medical costs, and that makes it strongly tempted not to hire workers to go for overtime or to go abroad or to otherwise keep down the ancillary costs that are associated with modern Social Security, social insurance programs. Maybe the time has come when we must examine those and see if, in some greater measure, they too should not be taken over as public cost. This runs against the strong current of view at the present time of the view of the role of government, but we should always remember that public current opinion can be wonderfully wrong.
You know, what Ken said a moment ago, that can't be overemphasized, the role of the Cold War, the wages, the price paid. As a result, even he spoke of the fact that labor management working together and kicking out many of the most militant labor organizers for being pinko or red or un-American. And the role that played is tremendous. Even the role of McCarthy. It may seem stretching a point to say that. The very nature of our language, what did people talk about in McCarthy days, scared as they were, because it's serious. So they talked about the latest gossip and movies and etc. What people talk about today, entertainment tonight. And so in a sense, McCarthy won, that he altered the nature of our language, that the trivialization become part of our society is not unrelated to the fear of serious talk then. And so in a sense, labor itself was affected, whether it's Lane Kirkland and George Meany, who were the cold warriors of labor, and whose interest was more, as Ken put it so well, in keeping down those troublemakers rather than challenging the big boys. That played a tremendous role, and it's a question of undoing that, especially. It's all kinds of stuff with the unraveling of the evil empire, so-called.
Studs Terkel, if you won't mind fielding a rather personal one. Most Americans of my generation and younger seem to feel that their own real coming of age came when they got their driver's license. Are you still one of the relatively few adult Americans who could afford to drive a car who doesn't?
I have
and
never
if so,
sat
why?
behind a wheel in my life. Now, that's a problem. You see, I'm a professional pedestrian. And so I'm aware of certain things. There's rules in cities that motorists, I could still call them automobile drivers, I call them, can turn on to the right when there's no other car going perpendicular. Is that right? Yeah. But I'm a pedestrian, and I got the green light. And they ignore the pedestrian. So I hold up my hand like that every time, like a cop, and I cross, and they screech to a stop. Now, my wife says, one day you're going to be smacked, and your two legs are going to be up on traction on it. Yes, I said, but I want to maintain my principles. You know? And so, no, but the fact is, I goof up on the tape. I must admit that I have lost, but something's interesting here. It works out to an advantage to you. I have lost Martha Graham by pressing the wrong button. I've lost Michael Redgrave, and I almost lost Bertrand Russell in North Wales. And if I did, I would have put my head in the oven. But the fact is, sometimes when I goof up mechanically, and this is interesting, someone I'm interviewing, say someone who's never been talking to a tape recorder before, some ordinary, so-called ordinary person. Nobody's ordinary, because extraordinary moments happen in everybody's lives, I think. But that person sees that I've goofed up, and that person says, look, it's when I had reels and before the cassette, look, the reel isn't turning. It's, oh my God, I forgot to put it on. That person feels pretty good, because not some Olympian figure from a TV channel interviewing the person, but kind of a goofy guy, you know. And so they feel pretty good about it. They feel needed. And to feel needed is what it's all about. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I listened to you with a very interest coming from Europe. You spoke about union, about fights, about war. And after all this comes only back to a fight between a man and a man. And I'd like to know, when you were in your 20s, what you thought about human potential and human nature, and what your life taught you, and what you now think, looking back at all these years, about human potential. And it's also a question to Professor Galbraith.
It was the Depression again in the 20s. I didn't know what I wanted. A civil service job. I wanted a 9-to-5 job. That was the desideratum, you know, to have a 9-to-5. So I almost worked for the FBI, I have to tell you. I got my Freedom of Information files, and there was a job called fingerprint classifier, paying $14.40 a year, CAF2. A fingerprint classifier, someone does a job classifying fingerprints for the Department of Justice. I didn't know it was FBI. It was 1934 it was, remember that. Got out of law school, which I hated. You know, I dreamed of Clarence Darrow and woke up to Julius Hoffman. So see, for those of you who may not know him, he was the lawyer, he was the judge during the Conspiracy 8 trial. So in any event, I found the files, and I have letters written to. This is a roundabout way of answering your question. This is called Variations on a Theme. It's a jazz way. And so they're the letters. Mine were longhand. I did well on the examination, interviewed by Melvin Purvis, whom Hoover hated. Melvin Purvis is the FBI guy who got Dillinger in Chicago. So Hoover hated him because he got all the publicity. And so Purvis says, I'm okay. And so a comment from Hoover called director, the only name was he was called director to the controller, put my name and someone else's name was blacked out on at fingerprint classifier 1440 here. Then it goes back and forth, but it comes another in the files that says, I'm a professor, University of Chicago, I could tell by the comments. He says, not a very good student, sloppy, slovenly, not much good, not the highest type of boy. And so Hoover to the controller canceled him. He's not the highest type of boy. And I start thinking, oh boy, if only the highest type of boy. There's a letter of mine to the Honorable Franklin D. Roosevelt, again longhand, accepted by Louis McHenry Howe, his appointment secretary, complaining about the dilatory behavior of the director. Well, obviously they send all these letters on, and I got a letter back with a note of distemper to it from the director, because I was aware then I would never make John Edgar Hoover's dance card. You know, I was like an ungainly suitor wooing a sought-after debutante. And so at the end I said, if only I were that, I might have wound up Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. Or better still, I might have wound up Clyde Tolson. So in any event, this is what I was thinking of at the time. So I didn't know what I was thinking, just generally, but there was a hopeful note. Again, we come back to the question of what was happening to those who were representing us. There was Harry Hopkins. There was Henry Wallace saving farmers. Harold Ickes, a very great public servant. The man Ken worked for directly, Leon Henderson, a remarkable man in charge of price control. And there was Little Black Marketing and all that. So it was an exciting moment, but you felt pretty good. At least I felt pretty hopeful. Please.
There was also, I must say that I wanted to respond to the question about the information revolution. I take a mental holiday whenever I hear that mentioned, because I am still struggling with too much information, with the problem of deciding which of it is any good and which of it is not. And I see nothing in the information revolution which will help me in that, making that distinction. But there was another great moment. Studs mentioned Clarence Darrow. I was reading about it the other day, and I must say, the Scopes trial, and I must say must have been one of the greatest moments of law in that trial. When Bryan unwisely took the witness stand, and Darrow asked him a variety of questions, among which was the need to affirm the literal truth of the scriptures, which William Jennings Bryan did. And he asked Bryan if Jonah was really swallowed by the whale. And Bryan affirmed that that was true. And he asked one or two other questions of the same sort, which Bryan equally affirmed. And then he asked, did Noah bring two of every living thing into the ark? And Bryan said, yes, the scriptures say so, and he did. Every living thing, yes. Every fish. And at that moment, Bryan faltered. He could not argue that Noah brought every species of fish into the ark. This, I must say, was one of the great moments of law. And I hope we have many more of them in the future.
Mr. Terkel, this is a question for you. I guess you've given a lot of interviews in your lifetime. What was one of the most interesting interviews you've ever given? And the second part of the question is, who haven't you interviewed or didn't have an opportunity to interview that you would have liked to have spoken with?
The first is very interesting. We'll tackle that one first. Sure, I'd like interviews. Some exciting ones with Chief Albert John Luthuli, who was the predecessor of Nelson Mandela. This was back in 1963. When the SB, I think was SB, a special branch, the Gestapo of then apartheid South Africa. I don't think they gave a damn about Albert John Luthuli then. He was old, and they were worried about Mandela. That was one. Russell was one. But I think the most interesting one to me was the former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan of Durham, North Carolina, Claiborne P. Ellis, who is today a remarkable man. Now that, to me, is what the human species may be all about. The possibilities of transcendence is in this man. Now I'm sounding like a preacher here. Now, C.P. Ellis, I read about him somewhere that the former Grand Dragon or Grand Cyclops of the Klan is campaigning for union in the company of a black woman who was his enemy. Now this begins with C.P. himself, a poor white all his life, having a hard time, one of the kids very ill. Everything he tries turns to dust, and it's the black guy, the nigger. He's taught all his life that. And one day he joins the Klan. They ask him to join the Klan. He describes that moment, this poor white with a robe on him and a hood on him, and he's walking down the aisle, 400 people watching. There's an illuminated cross in front of him. He says, I felt like I was somebody. Now, who else used that phrase? Jesse Jackson talking to Push to make people feel self-esteem. You are somebody. Only he was using it perversely. See, so a phrase can be used. Jesse using it in the affirmative way. See, in his way. But the point is, he felt he was somebody instead of a poor white trash. And bit by bit, the civil rights movement came into being, and Ann Atwater and he almost going to kill each other. Ann Atwater is a working woman. She leads the protesters who want to get clerks to work in the department stores. It's in the 60s now. And he and Ann have these fights, almost going to kill each other. He broke up civil rights demonstrations. And he says, bit by bit, something's cockeyed here. I'm still that poor guy. Something's gone cockeyed. And one day, during Carter's administration, so a lot of money comes into Durham for education. And there's a meeting called on behalf of fathers of all the school children. And this black guy calls the meeting involving Citizens Action, the White Citizens Council, as well as NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as the KKK. He's called them all in. The only one to show up from the KKK is C.P. Ellis. He said, why are you doing that, his friends say? He's because I got an interest in it. I got a kid. Why should they get all the dough? So here's this big meeting, and it's tense. And CP calls them names, and they call him names, and finally somebody says, there's got to be a standing committee. We got to continue. And someone nominates Ann Atwater as chairperson. And this guy, the chairman, says, I nominate an honest man, C.P. Ellis, as co-chairperson to work with Ann Atwater. And C.P. describes that moment, and it's hilarious and moving at the same time. Hey, what's that guy trying to do to me? This guy called me a good man, and he said, he's trying to fool around with my head. What's he doing? Remember, both are very religious. Ann is religious, he's religious. And that's part of the story, too. And then finally, meeting with Ann, they got a truce, they hate each other, but bit by bit by bit, one day she comes in crying because the black kids were laughing at her for going around with a Klansman. And he starts crying because the white kids are laughing at him for going around with a black agitator. And then they realize they're in the same boat. Both poor people. And then he says, then I start this crazy things happening to my head. And I add to his heart. I see a black guy walking down the street. He's as ragged as I am. Is he the guy keeping me this way? And then it builds. And then one day he says, he gets calls at night in the big shots. You did well, Claiborne, in breaking up that civil rights. You did well. The next day, walking down the street, and this guy who comes in, crosses the other side of the street, not to be seen with me. Wait a minute. Am I being had? Am I being used? And bit by bit, in the meantime, he works at Duke University, which is in Stanford. And Terry Sanford, the liberal senator, once governor, is head of it. And Terry's aware, Sanford's aware of this guy. Something happened. He works in the janitors union, custodial union, which is 80% black women. And they all know him now. And he's going to run for business manager because he's getting all kinds of recruits in it. And he's running, I ain't got a ghost of a chance because 80% black women. So I come up, I say to them, you know who I am? Here I am. Look at me. C.P. Ellis, because he holds a leaflet in his hand the company sent out. He's in his white robes. That's who I was. And they say, we don't want to hear anymore. So he thinks I'm finished. He says, I'm not going to win. He said, they elected me 4-1 because they knew me. And so that's when he starts bawling. And he says, I said they got that son of a bitch when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And today I read everything he wrote. I listen to it. And he's worked with you, and he's so proud of these women and himself. So that's C.P. Ellis. So to me, this is what I mean by it's scriptural in power. It's revelation and redemption and transcendence. So there is that aspect not yet touched by us. That's the thing. You know, Einstein, before he died, said, and I love to quote Einstein because no one dares contradict me. And Einstein, before he died, said, he blamed himself for the bomb, because of the equation. Never dreamed it would be dropped on humans. But at the end, he says, everything in the world has changed since the atom was split. Everything, irrevocably, except one thing, the way we think. And in a way, the C.P. Ellis story makes me think of what Einstein said, those possibilities not yet tapped. Anyway, he's the most interesting guy. Those I would like to have interviewed, well, Charlie Chaplin. Almost did, because remember, he was the first great artist of a wholly new art form. I mean, so something like that. Bernard Shaw, of course, you know, naturally. So, do we have any more? Yes, sir.
I wonder how someone was writing, working 100 years in the future, how that would be different, given the idea that, you know, technology is sort of...
Wow. Again, I'd like to have Ken on this, too, because now you're talking about technology, which I know, obviously going to be wholly different. The very nature, industrial work itself, or what were the new kinds of machinery and ways of work. So how do you see it?
I'll say a word.
All right. Well, I know nothing else to say because technology is something which I'm absolutely Philistinish. So I think of obviously tremendous changes, just as there were changes with the Industrial Revolution. And this is obviously post-industrial. So so the home economy went by the boards, and so something new happened in Manchester and Birmingham and elsewhere, and the whole world changed. The dark satanic mills of William Blake came into being, and now it'll be the dark satanic something else, perhaps. Yes, sir.
There's possibly sometimes when one should not attempt to answer a question. But as we look forward into the appreciable future, there is one thing of which we must all be aware, and that is that the consumer society with which we are so identified, as it spreads over the world, is going to cause enormous problems, both on the environment, on the resources available, even on the space available. We are the patrons, the custodians of a rather peculiar situation here in the advanced countries, which, as it extends itself to the less fortunate world, something we all instinctively wish for, is going to cause problems that are quite beyond anything we now perceive. I was very much impressed the other night when the Dalai Lama was here with a passing comment of his, which was quite extraordinary. He said, we have to contemplate what the world will be like when everyone in the world population is possessed of an automobile. It's a very interesting thought. One of the things on which we must contemplate if we're going to talk in terms of a 100-year cycle is the temporary character of the committed consumer society, or else its inherent limitation in scope as far as the world is concerned.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Certainly. We'll take one more here. Right here.
This is something that I think maybe both of you might be interested in, that we all might be. I'm Jim Tipton, lives in Cambridge. It happens that I am 85 years old, a little over, and so I identify with the two of you. Recently, I was in North Georgia, where I helped a longtime friend celebrate his 100th birthday. When I left his party in a nursing home, I leaned over and said to him, Frank, he's Lillian Smith's brother, Frank Smith, Rabun County, Georgia. Frank, you're the first person I ever knew personally who reached his 100th birthday. And just like that, he said, well, Jim, I'm the first person I ever knew personally who reached his 100th birthday. 6 years ago, Frank Smith wrote a paper on peace. He did it in the form of a conversation with a 19-year-old great-granddaughter. My question to the two of you, it was an interesting paper. I won't try to time this, but I'm interested. Do you think there's any hope of peace? And if so, what do you think people like us, especially the young people sitting here? might do to help.
You're raising a beautiful question. You mentioned Lillian Smith, Francis. By the way, those who may not know, the name he mentioned was one of the great women of our time, Lillian Smith. He's known best for the novels she wrote.
But also Killers of the Dreams.
Killers of the Dream,
One
novels.
hour.
Killers of the Dream, by the way, is what C.P. Ellis is all about.
Exactly.
It's very quickly, if I could just vary on the theme that you raised, and then we'll come to the question he asked, again varying on a theme. Killers of the Dream was a short piece that Lillian Smith, whom he mentioned, wrote about. Rich white talking to poor white. And Rich White says to poor white, I'll pay you $50 an hour. And the guy says, I can't live on $50 an hour. I got 5 kids. I'll get a nigger for 2 bits an hour. He says, you're better than him, ain't you? Look, both of us, we got the same. You're better than him. Which brings us, she predated Martin Luther King's speech in Montgomery. Montgomery, when in the back of the wagon, he said, the poor white's been fed Jim Crow instead of bread all his life. And so she is known for that, this great one. As to the question, hope, there has to be hope. This young man can end it with, it's also, I'm kind of evading. Do I feel as optimistic as I did when I was 20 years old? A question that our friend visitor asked. I don't feel as optimistic as I did then because I'm older, for one thing, to begin with. But hope, yes, because there's in the book the woman named Jessie Dela Cruz, formerly a farm worker, now in the 70s, still very active in Fresno. And she says, we have a saying in Spanish. I know some people speak Spanish. I'll goof it up. But roughly it says, esperanza, hope, something, muerta, dies al último, last. Hope dies last. We believe that. So that I feel. Hope, yes, of course. Without that, there ain't nothing. So I think we're on it. To me, we're in a transition moment. But since he's my senior by a couple of years, you're 85, I'm 83, and you're touching the big 87.
Well, I have very little to add, except a pattern which I hope I may follow. As Studs and I both recall, for many years, many years, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chairman, was Theodore Green, who was in that position into his 90s. His son, Bay Green, his nephew, Bay Green, was a great friend of mine, and he told me one day about going to see Uncle Ted, who hadn't made his will out for some 50 years, with the plausible result that everybody mentioned in the will was already dead. He said to Uncle Ted the case for making a new will, which didn't interest the senator very much, and finally he fell back on the oldest of arguments. He said, but Uncle Ted, you can't take it with you. And Theodore Green said, Bay, my boy, let me tell you something. I ain't going. I would like to think that Studs and I could end on that note tonight. Thank you.